Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Chicago Humanities Festival program. What's next? Michael Roth on public speech. I'm Allison Cuddy. I'm the Marilyn Thoma Artistic Director of the Chicago Humanities Festival, and I'm so pleased to be here with you. So What's Next is an ongoing series that brings new thinking to longstanding, sometimes intractable issues, including free speech, voting, public safety, and more. This week, we have kicked off our fall season, which runs through November, and we hope you'll join us every Wednesday and Thursday night at 7 p.m. Central for live programming, and keep your eyes on your email for other opportunities to engage. We'll be announcing new programs over the coming months, so stay connected. You can learn more about upcoming events on the theme of vision at chicagohumanities.org, and there you can also help support our free programming by donating or becoming a member. Thanks to our captioner for making this event accessible. You can activate that closed captioning within the YouTube environment. Tonight's program with Michael S. Roth is generously underwritten by Harpinder Ajmani in honor of his late parents, Labh and Rajendra Ajmani. Thank you so much, Harpinder. All of our programs this week are presented with the support of the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. So be sure to tune in tomorrow at 7 p.m. for a very lively and timely conversation about monuments and memorials. And now, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the president of Wesleyan College, Michael S. Roth.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you very much. It's good to be with you virtually and to be able to talk with you about a subject that never generates any controversy: higher education. Colleges and universities, not in the news, not causing anybody any angst. It is being president of a university these days is a little bit like being a punching bag from time to time. What I want to talk to you about this evening are, I guess, really three different subjects. The first one is a book I wrote, came out about a year ago, called Safe Enough Spaces. It's a pragmatist guide to free speech, political correctness, and intellectual diversity and other topics. And so I'll talk to you for a little while about the argument of that book, which was published by Yale University Press last year. And then I'll say a few words about how we move from the idea of safe enough spaces on college campuses to trying to stimulate our students to go beyond the protection of a safe space to engage in the civic world, in the political world, especially in the next couple of months, when it's of vital importance that students participate in the electoral system. And then just because you have a university president here, I thought in the last part of my remarks, I would tell you about what colleges and universities can do to be good public health partners for the cities and towns they're in, and to keep our students safe enough, given the raging pandemic. So lots of different subjects there. The first one, safe enough spaces, the second about political engagement, and the last about some words about COVID. So I think you may have a slide in front of you that says title Safe Enough Spaces. There are three parts to this short book. The first one is about from affirmative action to inclusion. The second one is about the use and abuse of political correctness. And the third is about intellectual diversity and free speech. I'm going to walk us through these issues around affirmative action and so on. First subject, right? Affirmative action. I started this book in part because I noticed that many of the people I have a great deal of respect for and work closely with as a colleague don't like to talk much about affirmative action, except when there's litigation, when it's under duress. But for most of the time, there's just a reticence about affirmative action because the people who benefit from it often don't want to talk about those benefits. And the people who feel they've been robbed of something because of affirmative action want to talk about it, but feel ambivalent about their resentment in that regard. And so in the last, I would say 5 to 7 years, universities and colleges have tried to move away from talk about affirmative action to talk instead about equity and inclusion. Talk less about demography, talk less about diversity, and talk much more about inclusion. I think part of the reason for this is that there's just no way to win an argument about who really deserves to be at a highly selective college or university. I work at a fairly small place. Wesleyan University has about 3,000 students, so we have roughly 800, a little under 800 students each year in each grade. We get about 14,000 applications for those 800 spots. 80% of the people who apply to a school like Wesleyan, and I think it's the same at University of Chicago or Northwestern or any of these great and highly selective schools, 80% of the people who apply to those schools are capable of getting the average grade at the school, which in most of these places is an A minus. And so it's very hard to say, well, Sally didn't get in, but Ryan got in, and Ryan deserves it a lot more than Sally. There's no obvious reason why Sally's application was denied. Jeff Selingo, who's a really thoughtful commentator on higher education, a journalist, writes about these matters, has a new book coming out any day now about the admissions process at some very well-meaning, highly selective colleges and universities, and he shows in the back offices, not that it's corrupt or people are trying to do bad things, but he shows how personal the choices are for deciding that Ryan got in, but Sally didn't get in. And what's really challenging about that is that you have families who want to understand why their son or daughter, or admission candidates who want to understand why they didn't get in and their neighbor did, or someone else they imagine getting in undeservedly. The problem is that when so many people want to go to the same schools, it's impossible for those people to be served well if they're all admitted. And so schools stopped talking about affirmative action and letting more people in from a region or from an underrepresented group. I started talking more about inclusion. And I see this among students too. What I mean by that is this. Students who were on campus would say to me over these last several years, when there's a protest, and at Wesleyan there often is a protest, they would say to me, Roth, you only admitted us so that you could put people of color on the webpage or in the catalog. You only want us here to make yourself, a good liberal, feel more righteous, more virtuous. You don't really make us feel included. And I was stymied by this. I thought, well, so what does it mean to feel really included? What kind of metrics do we have to tell whether African American students at Wesleyan feel really included, or Asian American students at the University of Chicago feel really included? It's hard to measure, but it's easy to support. Affirmative action was easy to measure, but hard to support. Nobody's really against inclusion. We don't say to people, oh, we don't really want you to be included. We want you to feel marginalized. No one says that. And so we create offices of inclusions and deans of inclusion and deans of equity and resource centers to give people a sense of belonging. And for many students at these schools, that's a great challenge. You can imagine why. I'll just give you one obvious reason why. As inequality has gotten more extreme in the United States, as it has over the last 20 years, but especially in the last dozen years or so, as inequality has gotten more extreme, it's very hard for students from very different walks of life to feel they're all part of the same enterprise. When you have a kid from a foster home in Texas sharing a suite with a kid from New York whose parents' name is on the building because they gave so much money, they're supposed to feel like they equally belong. But rich people find it very easy to feel they belong. And poor people can easily feel that they don't have access to the dimensions of a college experience that rich people really do enjoy. And so over the years, we've seen at many colleges and universities of movement to try to invest greater importance and pride in being a low-income student, in being a first-generation student. We understand you were a first-generation college student. And I have to say, well, not really, because in 1975, there were no first-generation college students. That category, we didn't use that category. My parents didn't go to college, so I guess I meet the definition today, but there wasn't a group that identified as such. Today, first-generation low-income students, as we call FGLI students, feel a sense of belonging with one another, but also a sense of alienation from the institutions of which they want to be a part. So instead of emphasizing the numbers of students from different groups, many colleges and universities have tried to emphasize instead the soft cultural factors that go into making a student feel included. The most obvious and in some ways the most challenging to achieve is to have a faculty and a university leadership that looks like, that's the phrase that's often used, that looks like the students from underrepresented groups that want to feel included. They want to see people like themselves on the faculty and in leadership positions. In colleges and universities, many places are competing for those qualified and talented candidates. But it's hard to make students feel included in institutions whose culture, up until 25 years ago, did always exclude them. There's another reason why it's hard to make students feel included all the time. And that's because colleges and universities pride themselves on supporting critical thinking. And in my book, I talk a little bit about the tension that exists sometimes between critical thinking and inclusion. I mean, so if I'm in a biology class and I raise my hand and I say to the teacher, hey, this evolution stuff is fine, but, there's another theory, creation by design, the biology teacher may just tell me I'm dead wrong. And I may feel I'm not being included. The biology teacher may feel, no, you're just being corrected. But if you find yourself being corrected again and again by your teachers because you're wrong, let's say you in a math class, you're just getting the wrong answer. If you find yourself being corrected again and again because you're wrong, it's hard to feel included. On the other hand, we don't want faculty to neglect telling their students they're wrong, right? I have a friend who teaches in a medical school in New York. I guess I shouldn't say which. And she tells me that she was told doing rounds, she shouldn't tell one of the medical students when they're wrong doing a diagnosis. Don't say that in front of the patient. It's too embarrassing. And she said to me, I have to say it in front of the patient. It's so important for the patient to know and for the medical student to know that they're wrong. But there is a tension between inclusion and critical thinking. And somehow that tension should become educationally productive on campuses rather than destructive. So that's this first section of the book. And I chart the changes in the language around affirmative action from the 60s until very recently in the Harvard case. And now Yale is being sued by the Trump administration in regard to their policies of admissions. Enough about admissions. Let's move on to political correctness. There's another slide here that just gives you the outline of the argument about the use and abuse of political correctness. And I'm a historian. My own background is as an intellectual historian. And so I chart the way in which the idea of being politically correct moves from a Marxist world to a different world. I talk a little bit about Alan Bloom and the influence of his book on colleges, universities. And then again, I end with a tension. The tension of part one was critical thinking and inclusion. The tension of part two is academic freedom and indoctrination. So let me say a little bit about those three things. We can get rid of the slide for now. I thought it was fascinating how the words politically correct used to be used jokingly by people on the left to kibitz with one another. At first, it was actually used to criticize people who weren't towing the party line, literally the Communist Party line. But over time, especially by the late 60s, the words politically correct among people on the left were used in order to criticize someone for being too doctrinaire, for being a conformist. And so when you go from a kind of leftist Marxist party structure, Communist Party structure in the 30s through the middle or early 1960s to a new left that was more interested in being anti-conformist than being theoretically in the right, the words politically away among people on the left that you're being too doctrinaire. That all changes. That all changes in really in the 80s and 90s. And I start with Alan Bloom's influence. I'll do that tonight because although Bloom doesn't use the words politically correct, he describes a phenomenon of groupthink on campus. That description of the phenomenon gets repeated again and again and again, and still today is repeated again and again. The critique of cancel culture is just another version of Alan Bloom's criticisms of American college campuses in the 80s. Now, Alan Bloom, you may know, because many of you are from Chicago, I think, for the Chicago Humanities Festival. Alan Bloom was a longtime professor at the University of Chicago, worked on Rousseau, was a student of Leo Strauss's, worked some on other contemporary French thought, despised the New Left student movements. And he wrote a book in the 80s called The Closing of the American Mind. Some of you will remember the book. It was really a surprise bestseller because in many ways it was a really philosophical book that offered a critique of the ways in which Americans and most moderns really use history as a vehicle for deciding what's right and wrong. You hear this today. People say, you want to be on the right side of history, as if that meant you were right, that history always comes out right. Bloom is very critical of this. And much of the book has this philosophical critique of that way of thinking. But the part that caught fire, the part that really was influential wasn't so much that. That's a Straussian critique that he rehearsed. But the part that caught fire was his critique of young people for saying they're really tolerant, but they're so tolerant they have no conviction. They're so tolerant that they will attack anyone they think is intolerant. So you get this kind of inverse Puritanism, right? And he really didn't like youth culture. I mean, he has these things about rock and roll music, and it's too sexual. He liked young people, but he didn't like youth culture. And so for people on the right, and actually people of a certain age who don't like not being part of youth culture, this critique of youth culture was like catnip. It was so delicious. One of the things that continues again and again in American history is just hatred of the young by people who would rather be young but are no longer young. So they critique the culture of the young. They're not like we were when we were young is really I think the subtext here. Be that as it may, by the 1990s, this critique of campuses as being places of indoctrination and being places where everybody thinks the same way, that catches fire. Roger Kimball wrote a book in the 90s called Tenured Radicals. The first edition uses the words political correctness just a couple of times. The next edition, it's sprinkled throughout the book. And a series of people following this politically correct. No one defends it. Everybody's against it. So you know it's a kind of empty concept. Both President Bushes gave speeches about political correctness, attacking it. Bill Clinton gave a speech attacking political correctness. Even President Obama gave a speech against political correctness. You can tell the concept is kind of empty when everybody can use it as a punching bag. And no one weaponized this idea of political correctness more than Donald Trump. So when he was asked this question in the very beginning, one of the early primary debates, I think it was by Megyn Kelly, for sure it was, about his nasty comments, the word nasty is his, about women, his response was, political correctness is killing our country. Because people seem to like that. And this idea, the weaponization of political correctness as a vehicle for attacking youth culture, is something I describe in the book. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm in favor of groupthink. It doesn't mean I'm in favor of what is called cancel culture today. I realize that there are many people who are criticized unfairly, and there are many people who are ostracized in mean-spirited ways. But I think at least what I try to show in the book is that there's this tension between the desire for greater freedom of thought and everybody jumping on the bandwagon of anti-political correctness. It's paradoxical, right? I mean, we're saying we want people to think for themselves, and everybody's joining in on attacking the same boogeyman. Even at Wesleyan, I mean, there was a bunch of students who made a movie in the 90s called PCU. You may have seen it. It's a comedy about a kind of an Animal House thing, but it's against politically correct, what we would today call social justice warriors. But on campus, the tension is between professors who should have the right to teach how they want. They should have the academic freedom to deliver the course material as they want. And then groups today who really worry, especially from the right, that professors are indoctrinating their students, not letting them think for themselves, and imposing on the students the professor's own point of view. As a university president, I certainly know that some faculty have biases, just like the rest of us. But I also think that this notion of student indoctrination is way overblown as a vehicle for criticizing the politics of universities, but also for expressing a kind of contempt for youth culture and the teachers who are closely aligned with youth culture. So that takes us through about 2/3 of the way through Safe Enough Spaces, which again is just a short book. It's an easy read at night. It helps you sleep if you're interested. But the third part of the book is and there's one as a slide for this, is about free speech and intellectual diversity. And here I am in Chicago, the home of the Chicago principles from the University of Chicago, which are an expression of a devotion to free speech. I am critical of what I think was a very successful, I could say, branding exercise by the University of Chicago, but I don't think that any educational institution should have, or really does have, an absolutist view of free speech. And so what I describe in this chapter, the third and final chapter of the book, is the way in which a libertarian approach to free speech catches hold in the last 25 years. And so that the doctrine of free speech as an absolute priority gets embedded in court decisions. And when political actors want to achieve a policy objective, they code their policy objective in the language of free speech, because in that way, they can achieve their policy objectives. the substantive thing they want to accomplish. Let's say, like in Citizens United, allowing corporations to make campaign contributions as if they were individuals. That substantive policy objective is accomplished by the court deciding that corporations should be able to exercise their free speech. I don't go into this in great detail, but there's a similar pattern in Second Amendment right to bear arms jurisprudence to making that an absolute legalistic procedural connection. It makes it very hard to see how one can have thoughtful policy choices about who has guns where, because anytime one tries to do that, one is accused of being on a slippery slope to taking everyone's firearms away. In free speech, anytime people are thought to be curating or limiting speech, they're said to be on a slippery slope to totalitarianism. I think this is bad arguments, and I try to give counter arguments in the book, because I think that colleges and universities cannot depend only on the marketplace of ideas for education. The marketplace of ideas is a very important dimension of education, but just like the marketplace, you have to sometimes we restrict the marketplace by saying people have to wear seatbelts. We restrict the marketplace by not allowing certain kinds of industry to pollute the environment for everyone. And we can restrict free speech in order to achieve educational objectives. Now, I can, even though you're not in the room with me, I can hear you saying, how could you do that? Because once you do that, you're on a slippery slope to, I try to offer an alternative vision of educators having to curate speech, almost always defaulting to more speech is better, but not always. No one always goes in that direction, because sometimes speech is also an action that causes harm, and that we have to be able to determine how to give people safe enough spaces so that they are protected from intimidation and harassment, but not so safe that they don't hear ideas that would just make them uncomfortable because that makes them really think hard about things. We need, in other words, and this is the final part of the book, we need more intellectual diversity on colleges and university campuses. So a few years ago in the Wall Street Journal, I announced at Wesleyan a affirmative action program. This pleased no one. The conservatives said, we don't need affirmative action. We just want the marketplace of ideas and our truth will come out. My radical friends and progressive friends said, how dare you use the words affirmative action and sully them with the idea of conservatism? I made the point, and I have tried to make this argument whenever I can, that university presidents and leaders of faculty should recognize that in the humanities and interpretive social sciences, there is a strong bias to the left and against conservatives. When people hear conservative and they think of a corrupt, sycophant, narcissistic, authoritarian regime of the kind we have in Washington right now, that's not what I mean by conservative ideas. I also came out in 2016 before Labor Day and said that educators should try to stop the Trumpian calamity, a calamity I think it has been and will continue to be if he continues as our president. But I don't think that we should let the current regime in Washington prevent our students from learning about the dangers of state power, the importance of religion in community life. The theorists who wrote about the necessity for family structures as an alternative to political structures. I think we need to have a concerted effort, given the biases of the academy today, to bring into the conversation traditional conservative and libertarian views and religious views around those issues where we have enduring questions that these ideas allow us to learn from. And when I have my conversations, sometimes heated conversations with faculty colleagues, they say to me, I can teach Aquinas, even though I myself am like for me, I'm a secular Jew, kind of secular Jewish, and I teach Aquinas, and I try to do as good a job as I can. But I don't think that we should have universities where that the only people teaching conservative thinking are people who already have decided that thinking is wrong. We should have some people on campus who are seriously engaged with these ideas because they're contenders for illuminating enduring questions that our students need to learn more about. So I think that when you bring these new ideas into the conversation, whether it's Aristotle or Aquinas, whether it's Mary Wollstonecraft, or whether it's contemporary Catholic theologians, whoever these, when you bring these ideas into the conversation, you will find some students saying, "Oh my goodness, that's inappropriate. That's not how we think today." And of course, that's a good thing. We want our students to confront ways of thinking that seem to them alien. And we need, as faculty leaders and university, to curate conversations on campus to ensure that there are a variety of perspectives are heard. Now, I know the slippery slopers out there will say, well, so you want to bring Nazis on campus, you want to bring the contemporary neo-fascists on campus for intellectual diversity. No, just like with the free speech conversation, I don't think we have everything goes. We don't believe everything goes in universities and colleges. We're not going to invite a bunch of clowns to come and insult people, or people whose ideas don't illuminate enduring questions. We have to make judgments about them. Procedures will not be a substitute for judgments about what ways of thinking can illuminate enduring questions and contemporary problems. So I think of this kind of environment as a safe enough space. The title, which my wife helped me come up with, the title "Safe Enough Spaces," is a kind of joke. In the 50s, the psychoanalysts talked about good enough mothers, and then it became good enough parents when they realized father's parent too a little bit. But a good enough parent was a parent that didn't make you crazy, didn't make you psychotic. A safe enough space is a space in which, if you're a woman, you're not going to be harassed. If you're a person of color, you're not going to be given a series of micro and macroaggressions. If you're a person who has historically from a group that's not belonged at the university, you are not feeling disenfranchised all the time. It should be safe enough so that you have access to learning, but not so safe that you only hear what you want to hear. Just like a good enough parent was a parent who didn't make you crazy, because if the parent worked too hard to make your youth perfect, they would make you crazy. And if the space is too safe, of course, it's not an educational space. But if it's a place where anything goes, then the people with power and money and privilege will continue to lord it over others. So intellectual diversity is the trophy that we should seek at the end of the book, or the end of our thinking about what makes a powerful education. A powerful education will take us to the next slide. A powerful education can only take place when people are safe enough. That's what I've been saying, right? I was thinking women shouldn't be hit on in class, right? And gay people shouldn't be beaten up on the way home from a party. Those things, making safe enough spaces. But today, of course, a safe enough campus means safe enough from this virus. And you know, I speak about the subject with some trepidation. Wesleyan has been open for a few weeks this fall. We have about 3/4 of our students are back, maybe a little bit less, and everyone's wearing masks. The first week, 2 weeks, we're quarantined. The first week of classes was was online, and now we have about half of our classes online and half of them kind of in person and hybrid. We're testing people twice a week, everyone twice a week, because if you have to wait too long for your test, and ours come back from the Broad Institute, if you have to wait too long for a test, they're kind of useless because you've met too many people and potentially infected them. And we worked with public health authorities, as did many schools of our size. We have about 3,000 students, as I said in the beginning, and as many schools of our size. We worked very hard to convince our faculty and our students that this is something we have to do as a community. If we're going to open, we have to protect each other by avoiding large crowds. Doesn't mean you can't socialize at all, but avoiding large crowds, wear a mask when you're not in your room, and wash up, use some common sense. I tell you, it's been a fascinating thing, because over the summer I had many people writing to me saying, you're crazy to open because you're putting people at risk, as if they would have no risk if they were at home going to bars in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. On campus, it's not like it's risk-free, but we do have a supervised structure of safety with guardrails of testing and supportive isolation. Now, I tell you all this not because I think Wesleyan is doing so well, because if I say that, I'll jinx it, and I don't want to do that. So far, like other schools our size in New England, things are going okay. Things are going well. However, I say that to you because it shouldn't be the responsibility of colleges and universities to decide how to keep their students from getting a virus. This is a fundamental public health responsibility. Now, Wesleyan is a fairly wealthy school, so we could spend millions of dollars on testing. But all across the country, this kind of coordinated response of testing, supportive tracing, and supportive isolation, as Daniel Allen and many others have argued, this would be a coordinated federal response. If we were really in a war against the virus, we would have leadership from Washington to coordinate a response that would keep our citizens safe, as we're trying to keep our students safe. Now, of course, at much bigger schools, it's harder to do that, right? We're a small community. We can talk to lots of people. We have students calling us and say, "Hey, Harry wasn't wearing a mask." We can call Harry, there's a way of doing it in a smaller community that's easier, for sure. However, this investment in the nation's public health should be led by the federal government, and its failure to do that should still shock us. It doesn't perhaps shock us anymore because there's so many failures. Colleges and universities can be safe enough spaces if students avoid large crowds, if students wear masks whenever they're not eating and in a private situation, and where you have supportive isolation that's supervised. Those are expensive things to do, but they can be done. They can be done. Someone said to me, a local journalist said to me, President Roth, don't you think you're asking too much of students? You know what 20-year-olds are like. They're going to want to go to big parties. I reminded him that the men who landed on the beaches of Normandy were the same age as my college students. Our low expectation for or infantilization of college students is not right. Don't tell me about their prefrontal cortex. If you have higher expectations for your students, give them a chance to rise to the occasion. They may well do that. Now, I don't just count on them rising to the occasion. I test everybody twice a week because I want to make sure that we can prevent the spread of the disease. But in South Korea and Germany and other places, the combination of testing, tracing, and supportive isolation has reduced harm. Doesn't eliminate harm. It just becomes a safe enough environment. And that takes me to my final slide, which I hope you're seeing, which is how do you go from these safe enough environments to participation in the public sphere? So last fall, just before winter, we circulated a few basic principles. You have them there in front of you. Developing civic preparedness is a core element of the mission of American higher education. Participating in American political life helps students learn from a diversity of ideas. And empowering teachers and students to engage with complex issues facing the country are crucial facets of higher education's contributions to the public good. So in a nutshell, if we can get our students to engage in the system, not just to march in the streets, that's not unimportant, that's very important, but to engage in the electoral system, to participate in the races for mayor and the school board and the zoning board, and also for Congress and the president. If we can get our students to do that, we are actually teaching them about democracy and about how to use their education for the public good. It's good for students, it's good for schools, and it's good for the country. I think that there's no originality. We're at an inflection point. We're at a crucial moment in American democracy. And we need young people, not just to be objects of derision or pity. We need young people to tell us what kind of future they want to have, to participate in the electoral system and help decide one way or the other the direction of the country, the direction of our climate policy, the direction of our civil rights policy, the direction of our economy. I think it's the job of presidents of colleges and universities around the country, and I wrote to every one of them to ask them to join in and support these three principles and to actually work to get their students out there. Many schools are doing it. Now, COVID makes it harder. I imagine last fall that they'd be knocking on doors and meeting people. That's not so in most of the country because of COVID, but there are lots of ways virtually to engage with your fellow citizens. And we at Wesleyan, and we have, I think, a few hundred partner schools now all over the country. We have small Christian colleges and big university networks and HBCUs and we, a very wide variety of schools that say they will find a way to energize their students to participate in the democracy that we claim to value. And if we can do that, I think we'll have a much closer to the government we deserve than what we have right now. Thank you so much for zooming in tonight. I hope you found this interesting. I realize that different parts of it. We have some time for questions. So I am going to look at my Google Doc and see if there are questions that are coming. We have a few minutes more questions. So I don't know the etiquette of this, so I'm not going to read the names of the people asking questions, just in case they didn't expect me to. So the first question, so how did it work out, your effort to attract conservatives to Wesleyan? Well, it worked out pretty well. One of the first things that we were able to do, which I think has been fascinating, is to hire military veterans to come to us. Military, well, we have a veterans program. I talk about this in the book, where we bring about 10 military veterans every year on full scholarships as new undergraduates. And I think the University of Chicago recently signed on to this program with the Posse Foundation. But we did something else too. We hired a retiring military officer who had academic credentials to come and teach at Wesleyan in ways to illuminate and strategy and international relations. And that's definitely added a different dimension to our faculty than we had before. And we started a lecture series that would bring conservative thinkers and writers to campus, as well as people working on those subjects. In other words, we didn't really ask them to identify their politics, but sometimes you could tell. And I think it's worked out pretty well. I recommended someone who came who was actually a Trump supporter. That's not why I recommended him. He's an English professor who's written many books. I went to that lecture because I had been responsible. And I was nervous because it was packed with people, which made me very nervous because I thought maybe it'll be like Middlebury and they'll try to stop the guy from speaking. They didn't stop him from speaking, but he gave to my mind, a terrible lecture, but not just to my mind, to everybody's mind. It was pretty lazy intellectually, and the students just tore it apart with good questions. And at some point, like, I don't know, halfway through the questions, a student raises his hand and says, well, if this is what President Roth means by bringing conservative thinkers to the campus, I hope we can do a lot better in the future. And I was embarrassed, but I was also proud that this student brought Antonin Scalia to campus to give a lecture years ago, and I had to invite him. I tell the story in the book. If I didn't invite him, I would have protested him coming. I wouldn't have tried to keep him from speaking, but I would have protested because of the enormous harm I think the man did to the interpretation of the United States Constitution. But I had to, it was a recommendation, so I was the person who invited him. I introduced him. So I had my views, but of course I could be wrong. So I introduced him graciously. I think he found, and he gave a lecture. There were demonstrations, but he gave his lecture. There was an antagonistic question and answer period. It was great. He really liked it. He spent the whole day actually on campus engaging with students. So I think that works out very, very well. Someone else asked, how about people who are disinvited from events on campus? You know, I'm no fan of disinvitation. It's awkward when you disinvite someone from anything. But I don't think we should spend too much time worrying about disinvitations from at commencement. Commencement is a huge celebration for the graduating class. And when you invite someone that most of them, or many of them, maybe not most of them, really don't find appropriate, I think it's, maybe sound trivial, but I think it's like if you're planning a wedding for, let's say you're one of your kids, and you choose the band, and you choose the band wrong because you don't actually know what kind of music most people want to hear. I don't think commencement speakers are the place to concentrate. I think that we should concentrate on hiring faculty in the humanities and interpretive social sciences and making sure that we're giving people with a variety of points of view a fair shake. And we're also being proactive, affirmative action, and seeking out talented conservative thinkers to spend really substantial amounts of time working with our students. So, you know, at that lecture I went to that I thought wasn't so good, I was worried that the students would try to exercise the heckler's veto. And I think that's wrong. And I think students who try to do that, I think students who try to do that should be disciplined. And we've done that at Wesleyan, where students have every right to protest me speaking, and they do, but they don't have a right to protest in such a way that I can't give the talk I'm supposed to give. And I think that's worked out pretty well. But I do think it takes real effort. I think that this is a bias, and like other biases, people prefer not to be reminded of them. And so it's important to remind them of their biases when you can. Any other questions that you can send to our moderator? I'm not seeing any more. The question was about these no COVID questions. You probably have enough COVID news. I know that the schools in the Chicago area have had to change their plans in different ways, which I think is not inappropriate, actually, as it's the facts on the ground change. You know, we at Wesleyan a privileged position because Connecticut has a very low positivity rate in our surrounding states due to knocking on wood. But I think that schools have to, given the absence of guidance from the federal government in most of these areas, schools have to figure out how to keep their students safe enough so they can learn, and safe enough so that they can thrive, and that means healthy too. So thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I wish I were with you in person in Chicago, but maybe next year. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.